Okay, in this video we're going to look at who won the Cuban Missile Crisis. Now the key people involved that we need to know about are General Batista, and he was the leader of Cuba between 1952 and 1959. He was pro-American, which meant that he supported the Americans. There was President Kennedy, who was leader of America between 1961 and his assassination in 1963. Fidel Castro, he was leader of Cuba from 1959 until the end of the Cold War, and Nikita Khrushchev, who was leader of the USSR from between 1953 to 1964. He takes over after Stalin's death in 1953. Now, the Cuban Missile Crisis itself takes place in October 1962. And the key thing about Cuba is, and why it's so important to America, is that it is only 90 miles away from the southern tip of Florida in the USA. Cuba was a place where lots of Americans went on holiday. There was a lot of American businesses in Cuba, so it was really important for American interests and wealth that they had a good relationship with the country's leader, as they did in General Batista. So let's start by looking at the Cuban Revolution in 1959, when Castro takes power. So like I said, this takes place in 1959. It is when Castro takes power from Batista. Now, the reason for this is that Batista is corrupt. He is hated by the majority of the Cuban people. Lots of Cubans are very, very poor, and he, like I say, was very corrupt and used the money that he made for mainly himself and his family and friends, and left the people of Cuba very poor. Castro said that if he was to get into power, he would help the poor, so he was very popular. Now, when he came to power, one of the first things that Castro did was he nationalized all American businesses in Cuba. This effectively means that he took them over. So they were no longer owned by American businesses, they were now owned by the Cuban government, led by Castro. He also exiled many rich Cubans who were pro-American. They favoured General Batista, they favoured America. And many of those escaped to Florida, so they actually went to the United States. Another thing he did was in 1960, he made a trade agreement with the USSR, whereby Cuba sent sugar to Russia in return for goods like oil, machines, money, and eventually weaponry. At this point, Castro declared that his revolution, in terms of getting rid of Batista, was communist. So now America has a communist country on its doorstep, 90 miles away from Florida. So how did the US respond to the Cuban Revolution? So, first of all, when Castro takes power and nationalizes all the American businesses in Cuba, the USA stops trading. And those were things such as sugar, oil, weapons, and aid, medicine, and so on. Now, sugar is the main export of Cuba, so the Cubans made a lot of money from selling sugar to the Americans. This actually forces Castro to seek trade with the USSR. So it actually forces Castro into a closer relationship with the Russians, more so than really what the Americans wanted. The Americans also produced anti-Castro propaganda. So they tried to basically badmouth him to the Cuban people and trying to make them stop supporting him. The CIA, the American spy agency, looked for ways to get rid of him. So trying to get rid of him and installing instead someone more like General Batista, someone who was pro-American. And the Americans also sponsored, and that's the key word, sponsored, the Bay of Pigs invasion. So the Americans don't actually invade Cuba themselves, because that could risk war with the USSR, but they will sponsor and train Cuban exiles, those men who'd been forced out of Cuba by Castro, to going back to Cuba and invade the country and hopefully get rid of Castro for them. Okay, so now to look at the Bay of Pigs invasion itself. So this was April 1961. So it's a year and a few months before the actual Cuban Missile Crisis. So it's not part of the Cuban Missile Crisis itself. It is one of the reasons why the missile crisis happens. So as we said, the CIA trains and funds exiles from Cuba to return there and hopefully get rid of Castro. The idea is that these men, these 1,200 exiles, will go to Cuba. They will land at the Bay of Pigs, because the Bay of Pigs is in the south of Cuba, and the people of Cuba will rise up against Castro and support the exiles and help to overthrow Castro. However, when they land at the Bay of Pigs, they are easily defeated within 72 hours by Castro's men. Now, Castro has around 20,000 soldiers, including himself on the beach. They're shouting orders, big boost for morale for those troops, and they're equipped with Russian weapons, so they are very, very well equipped. Now, the exiles have poor weaponry. They land on the beaches, for example, in rubber dinghies. And, like I say, this is a failure. Now, Kennedy failed to support the exiles as he'd promised. He said he would send air support to the exiles to help them, but he didn't. So therefore they have no protection and they are angry. The exiles who survive are angry with Kennedy. He is himself greatly humiliated. He's seen as weak. So he's there obviously trying to get rid of Castro, but instead he's failed in this. And everybody knew the Americans were involved, despite the fact that Kennedy, partly the reason why he doesn't send air support is because he wants to deny any involvement. But everybody knows, and he's made fun of around the world for the Bay of Pigs effectively blowing up in his face, and Castro, it does become a lot closer to the USSR because he's now seeking protection against any further American invasions. So, the consequence of the Bay of Pigs was, number one, it did show that Kennedy appeared weak. But number two, it forces Castro closer to the USSR than he was even before, because he's now looking for protection. So Khrushchev is all too happy to provide weapons, and by this we also mean nuclear weapons, to Cuba. So number one, his reasons were to restore the nuclear balance, and that's a key phrase. So the USSR had missiles in Turkey, and that was close to the USSR. So the Americans can attack major Soviet cities using their long-range nuclear weapons. Now, the USSR does not have long-range missiles. They haven't developed that technology yet. So they can't actually attack the USA. So one reason why, like I say, Khrushchev wants to put missiles in Cuba is because Cuba is only 90 miles from America, and therefore their short or medium-range missiles can attack nearly every single major US cities. They become targets now. So it brings the two countries back into balance. Both can attack each other with what missiles they have. Now, the second reason is because he simply wants to defend Cuba. Now, Cuba, as we said, is communist at this point. And having a communist country so close to America is great propaganda for Khrushchev. Remember, the aim of the USSR is to spread communism around the world, and here is a country in Cuba which has voluntarily become communist. It hasn't had to be forced to become communist. Castro chose to make Cuba communist. So also, they have just been attacked with the Bay of Pigs. So, very much so, Castro wants protection and Khrushchev wants to protect him. So there's no more US attacks on Cuba, and as a result, Cuba remains communist. And 3, he wants to be able to bargain, does Khrushchev, with the USA. So missiles in Cuba are a great way of having a bargaining chip. So if there was ever a problem between the two countries, for example, over what happens in Berlin, because Berlin is still a hotspot of the Cold War, then Khrushchev could use the missiles in Cuba as a threat to the United States, because obviously if they don't get their own way, they can threaten to use the Cuban nuclear missiles to attack the USA. So there's your 3 reasons: restore the nuclear balance, defend the Cubans against the USA, and also to be able to bargain with the United States. Okay, now we're going to look at Kennedy's options once he was told that missiles were in Cuba. So he's told this on the 14th of October 1962, after a spy plane goes over Cuba and takes photographs of the nuclear missile sites. Now, he's told by his advisors that he had 10 days before Cuba could fire the missiles at targets in America. But he's also told that more Russian ships are carrying missiles on their way to Cuba across the Atlantic Ocean. So he had approximately 4 main options of what he could do. So the first is he could just simply do nothing. Now, this avoids war, which is a good thing, but it makes Kennedy again look weak, and also leaves nuclear missiles very, very close to the USA. So that's not a good thing. So 2 cons there. Number 2, he could attack Cuba. Now, this is something that some of his generals wanted to do. So, for example, General Hawks really wanted and pushed for Kennedy to declare war on Cuba and, by force, take the missiles out. Now, the good thing about this one, it would remove the missiles if they were successful. So the threat of nuclear missiles has gone from the United States. However, if not done quickly enough, Cuba could launch the missiles at any major American city, killing millions. And also, it probably would become war between the USA and the USSR, because remember, the USSR is protecting Cuba now. So again, 2 cons. A third option was diplomacy. So Kennedy could talk to the Cubans and to the USSR. Now, a good thing about that was it could avoid war if the USSR did agree to remove their missiles. However, it would potentially make Kennedy look weak again, especially if diplomacy failed, and it still might leave missiles in Cuba. So again, it doesn't remove the threat of nuclear missiles in Cuba. So again, 2 cons and only 1 pro. So his fourth option was to blockade Cuba. So imagine there's Cuba, which is a terrible drawing, And what he effectively would do is put his navy around Cuba and blockade it. So essentially, there would be no casualties because he's not declaring war. 2, it would make it difficult to deliver more missiles. So 2 pros. Now, the problem with this is that there could still be missile sites in Cuba. So it hasn't removed the capability of Cuba to actually fire missiles at America, and it could start war. It could start war. If, for example, a Russian ship broke that blockade, so if the USSR did actually go through the American blockade and tried to get to Cuba, then President Kennedy did say he would declare war on the Russians, and that itself could have begun a nuclear war. So there's Kennedy's options. He could have done nothing. He could attack Cuba. He could have resorted to diplomacy. He could blockade. And in the end, he sees that his best option is to blockade Cuba. So that's what he does. He decides to blockade Cuba and tell Khrushchev that if any Soviet ships pass through that blockade line and try to get to Cuba with their missiles, then he will declare war. Okay, so let's look at the actual crisis itself. So, it begins on the 16th of October when Kennedy and a group of advisors get together to discuss those 4 options that we just looked at. Then, on the 21st of October, Kennedy decides to blockade. On the 24th of October, the US blockade begins. And Kennedy tells Khrushchev that if any Soviet ship carrying nuclear missiles crosses the blockade line, then Kennedy would declare war. And he's hoping he doesn't have to, but he is saying he will. On the same day, the Soviet ships turn around. On the 26th of October, Khrushchev sends a letter to Kennedy, and we call this his first letter. And that's to Kennedy. And he says he will remove the missiles if Kennedy publicly announces that he will not invade Cuba. So the missiles will leave Cuba if Kennedy promises not to actually ever invade. Then, on the 27th of October, Khrushchev sends a second letter in the morning. So this is AM. Second letter sent, saying he wants US missiles removed from Turkey. So he's pushing his luck. He's Khrushchev trying to get as much from Kennedy as he can. In the afternoon of the same day, so PM, Kennedy ignores the second letter to an extent. And his final decision is that he will announce not to invade Cuba. And that's done publicly. And in secret, he promises to remove his Turkish missiles. And then on the 28th, Khrushchev announces publicly that he has agreed to remove the missiles. So Kennedy publicly announces he will not invade Cuba. He secretly agrees that he'll remove his Turkish nuclear missiles. But Khrushchev announces publicly that he will remove the nuclear missiles and the nuclear missile sites from Cuba. And that is the end of the crisis. So, we need to think about who wins the crisis then. So first of all, let's look at Kennedy. So Kennedy can be seen to have won the crisis because he's seen as strong. He stood up to Khrushchev and publicly had Khrushchev back down. He got the missiles removed. So now there's no longer that threat of nuclear missiles on America's doorstep or in their back garden. However, also, the removal of Turkish missiles was a secret. He also is seen as strong for standing up to his own generals who wanted him to invade Cuba. He stood strong and decided to blockade Cuba instead. So he's seen as someone who can stand up to people who really were pushing for an invasion. However, he could be seen to have lost the Cuban Missile Crisis for the removal of the Turkish bases. And also, Cuba does remain communist. So the whole reason for trying to get rid of Castro in the first place, because he has declared that Cuba is communist, is still there. There is still that threat of communism right on his doorstep. Khrushchev, well, he could have seen to have won, because by the world, he is seen as the peacemaker. He's the person who came out publicly and said, I will remove the missile bases from Cuba, I don't want war, and therefore he's seen as someone who is a peacemaker. He also got the US missiles removed in Turkey, although that's a secret. And he still got the fact that Cuba is communist, still. And that's a good springboard to spread communism into South America. So he's got a place near America where he can spread communism. However, he could be seen to have lost because he's seen as weak by many in the USSR, and in fact China, another communist country, in fact China breaks off relations because he's seen as so weak. He's actually removed from power in 1964, and lots of people think it's down to the fact that he's seen as giving in to Kennedy. He's also not allowed to tell people about the Turkish removal. So he's not allowed to actually talk about what he gained from the Cuban Missile Crisis. So finally, the effects. So number one, it's seen as the start of the end of the Cold War. So the idea is that this was the closest point that the world ever came to nuclear war, and both sides blinked right at the last minute and decided that it wasn't worth going to war over, it wasn't worth firing these nuclear missiles at each other. Mutually assured destruction was avoided. And it actually helped US and USSR relations, and they set up between themselves a hotline. So between Washington and Moscow, they set up a hotline so that they can discuss problems a lot quicker, and it avoids future problems, hopefully. And also, a third key effect was that in 1963, they signed the Nuclear Test Ban Treaty. And the idea behind that is that neither side would test nuclear missiles anymore, and therefore try to decrease tension between the two sides. So it's the start of the end of the Cold War. They set up a hotline to help avoid these kind of problems in the future, and they actually agree to limit the use of nuclear weapons and not test anymore.